Picture the museum exhibit. You've seen it 100 times, maybe without quite registering what you were looking at. A life-size diorama of Stone Age Europe. A man stands at the entrance of a cave, or crouches over a fire, or raises a spear against a painted mammoth backdrop. He has pale skin, usually light or sandy hair, often blue or gray eyes. He looks, more or less, like a modern Northern European who's been given a fur loincloth and a slightly more dramatic jawline. That image is in museums across Europe and North America. It's in school textbooks. It's in documentaries. It's in the unconscious visual library most people carry around when they try to imagine what our deep ancestors looked like. There's just one problem. It's almost certainly wrong. In 2018, scientists at University College London extracted and sequenced the DNA of Britain's oldest, near-complete human skeleton. A man who lived about 10,000 years ago in a cave in what is now Somerset, England. They called him Cheddar Man, after the village nearby. The team used the genetic data to reconstruct his probable physical appearance with a level of precision that hadn't previously been possible. The reconstruction they produced stopped people cold. Cheddar Man had dark to dark black skin, tightly curled dark hair, and blue eyes. Not the chalk-white skin and sandy hair of the museum diorama. Not the fair Northern European look that most people would have guessed. A man who would have read as unambiguously dark-skinned by modern standards, wandering across the landscape that would one day become England 10,000 years before anyone who lived there looked much like the English people who live there today. The scientists who worked on the project were not particularly surprised, because Cheddar Man wasn't an anomaly. He was typical. Skeletal remains from hunter-gatherers across Western Europe, from Spain, Luxembourg, Hungary, Scandinavia, have been telling the same story for over a decade. The people who lived in Europe before farming arrived were overwhelmingly dark-skinned. The pale skin that most people today associate with Europeans is not ancient. It is not deep. It barely predates the Roman Empire in some parts of the continent, and it only became the dominant trait across Europe a geological eye blink ago. So, how did this happen? When did it happen? And why does almost every museum in the Western world still show us the wrong face? Let's start with the assumption underneath the museum diorama. The implicit story those exhibits tell is that pale skin is the original European condition, something ancient and fundamental, a trait that goes back as far as Europeans themselves do, carried by the first people who settled the continent and passed forward through every generation since. This story feels intuitive, partly because of how race and ancestry tend to get conflated in popular imagination. If light skin is common among Europeans today, and if today's Europeans descend from ancient Europeans, then surely ancient Europeans had light skin too. The logic seems almost tautological. It falls apart quickly when you actually look at the genetics. The first fully sequenced pre-agricultural European genome appeared in 2014 when researchers analyzed the DNA of Lobrania Man, a hunter-gatherer who died in a cave in León, Spain about 7,000 years ago. The lead researcher, Carles Lalueza Fox, of the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, described his reaction to the results in a way that was unusually candid for a scientific publication. He said that most of his prior assumptions turned out to be wrong. The biggest surprise, he told reporters, was that Lobrania Man possessed African versions of the genes that determine light pigmentation in modern Europeans, which indicated he had dark skin. Lalueza Fox noted something worth repeating. You see many reconstructions of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers hunting and gathering, and they look like modern Europeans with light skin. You never see a reconstruction of a hunter-gatherer with dark skin. That gap between the reconstruction and the reality is not a small error. It's a systematic misrepresentation of what the evidence actually shows, repeated so consistently across institutions that it started to feel like established fact. The evidence now establishes something very different. Light skin did not come with the original settlers of Europe. It arrived later, significantly later, carried by populations who migrated into Europe from outside and whose dietary circumstances created strong evolutionary pressure for a trait that the hunter-gatherers living there before them simply didn't need. The conventional wisdom isn't just incomplete. In this case, it is almost precisely backward. Let's go through the evidence systematically, because the Cheddar Man finding wasn't a one-off. It was the most famous confirmation of a pattern that had already been emerging from sites across the continent for years. Start with Lobrania Man, 7,000 years old, found in a cave in northern Spain in 2006. When researchers finally sequenced his genome in 2014, they found dark skin genes and, striking enough to merit its own headline at the time, blue eyes. The blue-eyed gene was considered by many researchers to be a relatively late European trait, something that arrived with or after the farming revolution. Lobrania man's genome showed it was present in hunter-gatherers long before agriculture reached Spain. He had the eyes of a modern Scandinavian and the skin tone of a modern West African. That combination, which seems jarring by modern standards, appears to have been perfectly ordinary for Western European hunter-gatherers of his era. Then there's Lochboer man. Found in Luxembourg, dated to roughly 8,000 years ago. Ancient DNA analysis placed his skin pigmentation in the dark to intermediate range. Same pattern, same period. Different country, same result. Cheddar man, dated to around 10,000 years ago, extends the picture further back in time and further northwest in geography to the British Isles, which had only been recolonized after the last ice age retreated a few thousand years before his death. Same dark skin, confirmed blue eyes, tight dark hair. Researchers have given this population a name: Western Hunter Gatherers, or WHGs. They were the dominant human population across most of Western and Central Europe from roughly 15,000 to 5,000 years ago, following the retreat of the glaciers and preceding the full arrival of farming populations from the southeast. When ancient DNA researchers have analyzed WHG skeletons from Spain to Hungary to Luxembourg to Britain, the pattern is consistent enough that it's now treated as a baseline characteristic of the group rather than an ST-DI and NWHG skeletons from Spain to Hungary. Individual variation. Dark skin, often blue or green eyes. Hair typically dark. It is worth pausing on the blue eyes with dark skin combination, because it challenges a second assumption most people carry alongside the first one. The common intuition is that light eyes and light skin evolve together, as a package deal, in cold northern latitudes with low sunlight. That intuition is wrong in an interesting way. Blue eyes and light skin respond to different selective pressures and are governed by different genes. The evidence suggests that blue eyes spread through European hunter-gatherer populations for reasons that remain somewhat debated, possibly sexual selection, possibly genetic drift, possibly some combination. But whatever drove blue eyes had essentially nothing to do with vitamin D synthesis or UV absorption. These are separate stories running on separate genetic tracks, and they unfolded on different timescales. Blue eyes arrived early, in hunter-gatherer populations with dark skin. Light skin arrived late, in agricultural populations where the selective pressure for it was completely different from whatever drove the spread of blue eyes. The two traits that most people think of as naturally linked going together by some deep biological logic were actually decoupled by tens of thousands of years of separate evolutionary history. Cheddar man and Lobrania man, with their dark skin and pale eyes, are not anomalies who complicate the story. They are the story. There's a useful way to think about just how recent the dominance of light skin in Europe actually is. The last major wave of migration into Europe that substantially shifted pigmentation genetics arrived with Yamnaya steppe pastoralis from the Pontic-Caspian region, roughly 4,500 years ago. But even after that migration, the spread of light skin variants was not instant. According to research published in 2025 by Peretti and colleagues, dark skin remained predominant in European populations until approximately 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, to put that in context, is roughly the era of early Iron Age Europe. Homer was composing the Iliad. Solomon's temple was being built in Jerusalem. The Phoenicians were sailing the Mediterranean. The pale skin of modern Europe is younger than the Trojan War. The genetics behind this story are now understood in enough detail to be genuinely illuminating rather than just abstractly true. Two genes do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to explaining light skin in modern Europeans. The first is SLC24A5. A single variant of this gene, one letter changed in one location in the genome, is associated with significantly lighter skin and is now found in nearly 100% of people of European descent. The second is SLC45A2, a variant found at frequencies above 80% across most of Europe today. Neither of these variants was present in the Western hunter-gatherers. Lobrania man had the ancestral, non-European copies of both genes. Lochboer man had the same. Cheddar man had the same. Across the WHG population as a whole, the variants responsible for most of the pigmentation difference between modern Europeans and modern Africans were simply absent. Not rare, not uncommon, Absent. So where did they come from? And how did they spread so completely across a continent in what is, by evolutionary standards, a very short time? The answer comes in two parts, corresponding to two major waves of migration into Europe after the hunter-gatherers. The first wave arrived around 8,500 to 5,000 years ago. Early farmers from Anatolia, in what is now Western Turkey. These people carried the SLC24A5 variant that is now fixed in European populations. They had it, and the hunter-gatherers they were gradually replacing did not. As farming spread from the southeast into Central and Western Europe, Anatolian farmer ancestry spread with it. Their pigmentation genes spread with that ancestry. But even after the Anatolian farming expansion, Europe was not yet the pale-skinned continent it is today. Ancient DNA from hunter-gatherer populations in Spain, Luxembourg, and Hungary dated to around 8,500 years ago, after the farming transition had already begun, still shows dark skin variants. The mixing between incoming farmers and resident hunter-gatherers was real but gradual, and the pigmentation shift lagged behind the agricultural one. The second wave came later. Beginning around 4,500 years ago, pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a vast grassland region north of the Black Sea, began a massive migration into Europe. This population, known archaeologically as the Yamnaya, brought with them a complex package of traits, technologies, and genetic variants that reshaped European ancestry more dramatically than any previous migration. Proto-Indo-European languages, the horse, the wheel, lactose tolerance in adults, and additional pigmentation gene variants that further pushed European populations toward lighter skin. The Yamnaya migration is now understood to have been one of the largest and fastest population replacements in prehistoric Europe. By roughly 4,000 years ago, Yamnaya-related ancestry accounted for the majority of the genetic makeup of populations across much of northern and central Europe. What emerged from the mixing of Anatolian farmer ancestry, Yamnaya steppe ancestry, and the residual hunter-gatherer ancestry that persisted in varying proportions across different regions was the genetic landscape of modern Europe, including the now near universal light skin variants that most people assume have always been there. The speed of this genetic shift is worth emphasizing. Evolutionary change usually operates over enormous timescales, driven by small, incremental advantages compounding across thousands of generations. The shift toward light skin in Europe happened fast by those standards, fast enough that geneticists describe the spread of the SLC24A5 variant in Europe as a selective sweep, meaning the advantage was large enough to drive the variant to near fixation across a huge population in a relatively small number of generations. Something was really pushing hard for lighter skin in post-agricultural Europe. The question of what, exactly, turns out to have a counterintuitive answer. The obvious explanation for why Europeans evolved lighter skin is cold and low sunlight. Northern latitudes get less ultraviolet radiation than equatorial ones, and lighter skin absorbs UV more efficiently, so populations that moved north would have faced selection pressure for depigmentation over time. This explanation isn't wrong, exactly. But it runs into a specific problem when you look closely at the European evidence. The hunter-gatherers. They were already in northern latitudes. For tens of thousands of years, Western hunter-gatherers lived at the same latitudes as modern Swedes, Scots, and Germans. They experienced the same low UV winters, the same overcast skies, the same weak northern sunlight, and they maintained dark skin throughout. If cold northern latitudes were sufficient to drive depigmentation on their own, the selection pressure should have been acting on European hunter-gatherers the entire time they were there. The fact that WHGs remained dark-skinned for tens of thousands of years in exactly these conditions, and that light skin only became dominant after the arrival of farmers points towards something that changed with agriculture rather than something about geography alone. That something was diet. Hunter-gatherers in Europe were eating fish, game, wild plants, and organs. This diet was extraordinarily rich in preformed vitamin D, the kind found directly in animal tissues, particularly fatty fish and organ meats that the body can use without needing to synthesize it from UV exposure. A hunter-gatherer eating salmon, herring, deer liver, and wild berries was getting enough vitamin D through food that dark skin, even in low UV northern latitudes, was not a meaningful liability. The skin didn't need to be pale to let in enough UV to prevent deficiency, because the diet was supplying enough vitamin D directly. Then the farmers arrived. Early Neolithic farmers in Europe were eating a diet dominated by cereals, wheat, barley, millet. Grains are essentially devoid of vitamin D. A population that shifted from a diet rich in fish and game to one centered on bread and porridge experienced a dramatic reduction in dietary vitamin D intake, with no compensating change in their UV environment. Suddenly, in low sunlight northern latitudes, on a diet that provided almost no vitamin D from food, the selective advantage of lighter skin became significant. Lighter skin synthesizes vitamin D from UV radiation more efficiently than darker skin. In a population where dietary sources of the vitamin had collapsed, the ability to squeeze more from weak sunlight became a genuine survival and fertility advantage affecting immune function, bone density, pregnancy outcomes, and a range of other health indicators. The selective sweep of light skin variants through European populations wasn't driven primarily by moving to colder places. It was driven by changing what people ate, or more precisely, by the farming revolution eliminating the dietary safety net that had allowed dark skin to function perfectly well in northern latitudes for tens of thousands of years. There's a useful parallel in the spread of adult lactose tolerance, which occurred around the same time and through some of the same population dynamics. Hunter-gatherers across Europe couldn't digest milk as adults. They lacked the gene variant that keeps the lactase enzyme active past childhood. The spread of adult lactose tolerance through European populations happened rapidly during and after the Yamnaya migration, driven by the advantage of being able to extract calories and, crucially, vitamin D from milk in exactly the conditions where the dietary transition had otherwise left people deficient. Two different genes, two different traits, same basic story. An agricultural and pastoral diet created specific nutritional vulnerabilities in northern European populations, and natural selection moved very fast to compensate. The cold was always there. The low sunlight was always there. What changed was the food. In February 2018, the Natural History Museum in London unveiled the facial reconstruction of Cheddar Man alongside the genetic findings that had informed it. The image that appeared on front pages across Britain and internationally showed a man with dark skin, blue eyes, and tight dark hair. It was striking, carefully produced, and grounded in the best available ancient DNA evidence. The reaction was instructive. A significant portion of the public response was perfectly calm, interested, curious, willing to update their mental image of early Britain. But another portion was something else entirely. Comment sections, tabloid opinion pieces, and corners of social media filled with accusations that the scientists had fabricated the results for political purposes, that the reconstruction was propaganda designed to undermine English identity, that dark-skinned Cheddar Man was an agenda rather than a finding. One British tabloid ran the story under a headline, framing it as a controversial claim rather than a confirmed scientific result. A far-right commentator with a significant online following called it an anti-white conspiracy. Johan Diekman, one of the UCL researchers who worked on the project, noted in subsequent interviews that the pushback had essentially no scientific basis. The genetic analysis was robust, the methodology was sound, and the findings were consistent with a body of evidence from across continental Europe that had been building for years before Cheddar Man. The dark skin finding was not a surprise to researchers in the field. It was a surprise only to people whose prior assumption about what early Europeans looked like had never been seriously examined. What the Cheddar Man controversy revealed, more than anything else, is that the mistake in the museum diorama isn't merely an aesthetic error. It has been doing real work providing a false sense of depth and antiquity to a particular idea of what European identity looks like and how far back it reaches. The notion that paleness is somehow the original European condition has been used explicitly in some contexts, and implicitly in many more to frame European identity as something ancient and biologically rooted. That framing depends entirely on a historical picture that the genetics have now substantially demolished. Light skin in Europe is not primordial. It is not even particularly old by the standards of human prehistory. It arrived, spread, and became dominant within a time frame that is, in evolutionary terms, almost embarrassingly recent. The people who built Stonehenge, who lived through the Bronze Age collapse, who traded with Phoenician merchants across the Mediterranean, their populations were still in the process of acquiring the light skin that later generations would come to think of as definitively, timelessly European. This doesn't diminish anything about European history or culture. The Neolithic farmers who carried new pigmentation genes into the continent also brought agriculture, domesticated animals, new social structures, and technologies that transformed human life. The Yamnaya herders who followed carried languages that would become the Indo-European family, including nearly every European language spoken today. These were real and profound contributions to what Europe became. But the specific idea that light skin is ancient, that it marks some unbroken line of descent from the continent's first inhabitants, is simply not supported by the evidence. Cheddar Man, the man whose bones are the oldest, near-complete human skeleton ever found in Britain, did not have light skin. The full dominance of light skin variants across the continent consolidated only within the last 3,000 years. The museum diorama, with its pale skin and sandy hair, is not a window into the deep past. It is, at best, a portrait of a very recent present, projected backward onto a history that looked quite different. So go back to that museum exhibit. The man at the cave entrance, fur loincloth, pale skin, sandy hair, spear raised against the painted mammoth. He's still there in most museums. But some museums have already changed their reconstructions. The Natural History Museum in London now shows Cheddar Man as he genetically was. The diorama is slowly, imperfectly beginning to look more like the evidence. What the corrected image shows is a man who would not look out of place in a crowd in Lagos or Nairobi or Kingston except for the blue eyes. He lived in caves and rock shelters across a landscape of dense post-glacial forest. He hunted red deer, wild boar, aurochs. He ate fish from rivers that no longer run the same courses. He moved across a Britain that was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge that the rising sea had not yet swallowed. And he had nothing to do with what most people today think of when they think of a northern European face. The light skin that eventually became the dominant trait across the continent he lived in was not his inheritance to his descendants. It was brought by people who came later, from different places, carrying different genes, speaking different languages, eating different food, and whose diets in particular created the selective pressure that drove one of the faster evolutionary changes in human pigmentation in the archaeological record. The mistake was not in assuming that populations adapt. They do, and they always have. The mistake was in assuming that the current version of a trait represents some original, ancient, foundational version, that what we see now is what was always there. Evolution doesn't work that way. Populations change. Traits spread and recede. What looks permanent and deep is often recent and contingent. Cheddar Man's descendants, the small fraction of modern British ancestry that traces back to WHG populations, carry his blue-eye genes forward into the present. His skin color genes, by contrast, were largely replaced by alleles that arrived with the farming and pastoral migrations that reshaped European genetics after his time. He contributed something, just not what the diorama suggested. The next time you see that museum reconstruction, pale skin, sandy hair, spear raised, it's worth knowing what it's actually showing you. Not the original European, not the ancient baseline, just the most recent version, dressed up in furs and placed at the beginning of a story it arrived at relatively late. The actual beginning looked different, darker, probably blue-eyed, and considerably more surprising than anyone thought to put on a placard.